We got it, and it was an unnecessary defeat for it was unnecessary for the Tories to put this at this time. Yes. It was not necessary to speak.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous et toutes. The sitting is open. La séance est ouverte. And I just remind members that they should insert their badge before taking the floor. And as you begin your speech, please press the microphone request button once only. The first item of business this morning is a debate on a report titled Long COVID and Access to the Right to Health, which is document 16088. Please. Presented by Ms. Carmen Leite on behalf of the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development. In order to finish by 11, I will interrupt the list of speakers at about 10:50, but I think when I see the list that it could be possible if everyone keeps on his 3 minutes to have everyone on the speakers list. But we need this 10 minutes at the end to reply and the vote. But now I call Ms. Leite as a rapporteur. You have 7 minutes, and then you have 3 minutes at the end to reply to the debate. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, voy a hablar en...
I'm going to be speaking in the language of Cervantes, Spanish, my mother tongue. It is a real honor for me to share with you this report on long COVID and access to the right to health, which is an acute challenge for our health systems as well as the lives of many people throughout Europe and the wider world. Although many people think that the pandemic is now behind us, for at least 22 million people in Europe, the impact of COVID continues to be a devastating reality. Long COVID is a chronic disease which affects people for months following on from their initial infection and manifests itself in the form of weakening symptoms such as chronic fatigue, brain fog, and neurological disorders. This disease, which in some cases can be compared to chronic fatigue syndrome, seriously harms the quality of life, the professional abilities, and social relations of the people who suffer from it. Unfortunately, notwithstanding its scale, long COVID continues to be a blind spot in terms of our public policies. We are facing a threefold crisis: a lack of a clear and consensual definition of the disease, limited access to diagnostics and treatment, as also the stigmatization and ignorance in parts of society and our healthcare systems. Now, in this report, we say that our approach should be based on human rights, as we'd already emphasized in Resolution 2373 of 2021, in which we made a call for the beefing up of the detection and treatment of chronic diseases, as well as the adoption of cross-cutting policies to reduce inequalities and also take care of vulnerabilities. And we therefore repeat that call. First of all, we need to guarantee sufficient funding for biomedical research. This is absolutely vital if we are to draw up a clear definition of long COVID, as well as roll out effective treatments. We also have to have a robust scientific basis for our policies. Secondly, we need coordinated policies at national level which are designed in cooperation with those who suffer from long COVID. We also need cross-disciplinary centres which are specialised in the diagnosis, treatment, as well as prevention of long COVID, as well as guaranteeing equity and access to healthcare. Thirdly, it's important that we use the example of my own region, Galicia, which has a special health service for post-COVID and provides 6,700 consultations per year for a population of 2.7 million. Thirdly, it's important that we provide dedicated training for healthcare staff, as well as mounting awareness-raising campaigns for the general public. It's important that there be better understanding and recognition of this disease if we are to counter the stigmatization of those who are affected, as well as protecting their rights. Fourthly, we should recognize long COVID as a disability under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That would make it possible to guarantee welfare payments as well as compensation, as well as properly adapted labour rights. Fifthly, our member states should promote flexible workplace and educational policies to allow those with long COVID to keep up their activities in appropriate conditions. Last but not least, we call for international cooperation. Europe cannot deal with this challenge on its own. We have to pool our efforts, coordinate our research, we have to share best practice, as well as mobilize resources at a global level. The socio-economic impact of long COVID is devastating. It is estimated that we have lost millions from the labour market in Europe, and it is costing up to 1% of GDP in OECD countries. But beyond the figures, we're talking about people, their lives destroyed, their families affected, and therefore we have a moral debt to those who bore the brunt of the effects of the pandemic. Here in the Council of Europe, we have to spearhead this battle. We are the guardians of human rights, and we have to make sure that we are a voice that leaves no one behind. Long COVID cannot be ignored, and we in the Assembly have an opportunity here to stand out, and that is why I call on all of you to see to it that in your countries appropriate measures are adopted. It is important that we guarantee that people who are suffering from this disease have access to proper health care, and I believe that they need to be given the hope of a full recovery. I would like to conclude by thanking the WHO, Dr. Soriano, for the contribution made as an expert, as well as to Ms. Chantal Britt, who shared with us her personal experience as well as that of other patients of the European Long COVID Network. And also thank you to the Secretariat of the Committee, of the Social Affairs Committee, particularly in this case, Ms. Catherine Dubernat-Rochy, for all of their valuable assistance. And thank you to all of you for listening to me. And I ask for your support on behalf of all of those who've suffered from long COVID. Thank you.
Gracias, Madame Leite. And now I open the debate. I call first Sir Chop.
Thank you, Mr. President, and can I congratulate the rapporteur on this report and say that I very much support what it says. But there is one glaring omission in the report, and it makes no mention of those millions of people who are suffering the wide range of long COVID-19 symptoms, but not caused by having been infected with COVID-19, but by having had COVID-19 vaccines. Their suffering is recognized by medical practitioners and clinicians and described as long post-COVID vaccination syndrome. And it is very similar in its diagnosis and the identity of it to what's described as long COVID in this report. There is far too little investment in identifying the causes of vaccine-induced long COVID, and also a reluctance to invest in trying to find effective diagnosis and treatments. The United Kingdom taxpayer spent over 10 billion pounds on vaccines against COVID-19, but spends next to nothing on helping those who suffered adverse reactions from those vaccines and continue to suffer in their daily lives. In the United Kingdom, those who have suffered death or serious disablement from COVID-19 vaccines are eligible for taxpayer payments of £120,000, and several hundred people have been able to access those payments. But for many thousands whose disablement is less than 60%, there is no help whatsoever. And it is to this group that today's motion should be directed. They want effective treatment, even more than financial redress. And certainly in the United Kingdom, they are not receiving it. And this is leading to all sorts of consequences. There has been in the United Kingdom, and I think elsewhere, an increase in the lack of confidence in a vaccine. And there's increased sickness, absence. What we need is a better understanding of the interaction of vaccines and our immune systems, particularly with the advent of mRNA vaccines. Governments made a big mistake in declaring that COVID-19 vaccines were absolutely safe. The German government, at least, has now apologized for this. We owe it to all those who had vaccines, against their better judgment often, but for the greater good, that we should look after those who have suffered and are continuing to suffer the adverse consequences of reactions against those vaccines. And that's why I hope that this report will make progress in medical circles, and that when people look at this issue, they will also include in their deliberations those who suffered as a result of the vaccines.
Thank you. Then I give the floor to Baroness Brinton.
And I congratulate the rapporteur on this excellent report and resolution. Health services for long COVID across the world are inconsistent and often not treated in the same way as other diseases. Ignoring the long-term health, economic and well-being of at least 22 million people in Europe and 70 million globally has significant consequences for the individuals, their families, and the economy. Many are denied recognition as disabled people because of health and governmental attitudes. Those living long-term with long COVID face underfunded specialist clinics or none at all. Worse, some clinics believe that this should be treated only as chronic fatigue and depression and don't even test for neurological, respiratory, and other key symptoms. Laura Spinney's 2016 book, Pale Rider, a social medical history of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, discovered that some doctors understood that many people, especially young adults and children who did survive the Spanish flu, were facing chronic fatigue, shortness of breath, and neurological illnesses afterwards. Sound familiar? Research projects in the 1920s by the Norwegian epidemiologist Sven Erik Mamelud and also the British doctor Alexander Fleming found that for some, an overactive immune system was also attacking the body in its fight to kill the virus. These days, it is called autoimmune disease, but sadly our societies have forgotten the lessons that we learnt after the Spanish flu. The hospital that I attend for my main autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis, has found that since December 2019, their patients with autoimmune disease have increased fourfold and is rising. This is an invisible part of long COVID. But there is good news. Despite what Sir Christopher Chope said, vaccination for those who had severe COVID can significantly reduce the impact of long COVID. Yet many countries only offer vaccination to a very limited number of people. So short-sighted, as the severity of long COVID means that too many patients are too disabled to work, which affects not only their well-being, it affects our economies. There is a lack of data, and worse, a lack of interest in funding research, because too many people say COVID is over. It is not, as long as millions suffer from long COVID. This resolution sets out all three of the World Health Organization's key things: recognition, research, and rehabilitation. Those living with long COVID are disabled in their lives should also be recognized as disabled by their doctors, government, and society, because they deserve it. They need all the help that they can get.
Thank you. So I give the floor now to Mrs. Chelek-Ozen.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, we congratulate the rapporteur and agree that a human rights-based approach is important to address the long-term impacts of long COVID on the physical, mental, and emotional well-being of individuals. We support the establishment of multidisciplinary centers where well-trained and well-equipped healthcare professionals effectively diagnose and treat long COVID. The recognition of long COVID under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is an important step in ensuring access to rights, but must be approached with caution. Missing from the resolution is a call for international research collaboration and data sharing, particularly to better understand the conditions of long COVID, post-vaccination, and chronic fatigue syndrome. The most striking statement of the report is that healthcare systems are still weak against the impact of the pandemic and do not have sufficient capacity to deal with long COVID. Just one important fact: the European Commission must allocate at least 500 million euros to combat long COVID. In the days of the pandemic, most of us thought that this was the end of the world as we knew it. But sadly, we have almost completely forgotten that. We have forgotten the price we have paid. Millions of people have lost their lives. Millions of people were left alone, helpless, and isolated. In a way, we became refugees in our own homeland, because our homeland was no longer the place we knew it. Despite everything, we have learned very little. We carry on as if nothing had happened. The pandemic has shown us that security is not just about strengthening military capabilities. The massive budgets that have been allocated to the security in Europe and around the world haven't protected us. Health systems have collapsed within weeks. We have painfully learned that security is only possible when we are in good health. Now we need to advocate for a shift in public health priorities in our member states, because health takes priority over everything else. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Giovannioli.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. I would like, above all, to thank the rapporteur for a very detailed and balanced report on this subject that causes us not only to reflect upon our experience and the long-term consequences of the most lethal pandemic in more than a century, but I think it also forces us to look at the importance of public funding of the health and preventive health sectors that should be seen not as a cost, but rather as an effective investment in order to guarantee what is a prerequisite for any human activity, in other words, health. Unfortunately, in the last 20 years, financial protection has been reduced gradually, with 2 billion people in economic difficulties and 1.3 billion individuals being pushed towards poverty as a result of the costs for their health care that they bear themselves. More than one-third of high-income countries, more than 20% of total health expenditure, people pay for out of their own pocket. But the average per capita public expenditure in most high-income groups dropped as of 2021, following an increase in the first year of the pandemic, the first drop in global health expenditure in real terms since the year 2000. Most recent dates show that in more than one-third of high-income countries, more than 20% of total health expenditure people pay for out of their own pockets. The risk, therefore, is to see an impairment in the quality of life with unacceptable differences in terms of who has the means to pay for quality health care and those who don't. That is unacceptable from an economic point of view, because less prevention means higher health costs in terms of treatment. Fewer resources means less professionalism and doctors available. So the recommendation that needs to go out from the parliamentarians and the Council of Europe is that expenditure on health shouldn't be considered a secondary issue, in particular expenditure on health prevention, but rather it's important in terms of human rights, the right to health, equal treatment, and social and economic development. If there's one body that plays a very important role when it comes to coordinating global health policies, it is the World Health Organization, from whose reports I lifted the figures that I've shared with you. Unfortunately, as if this was an irrenounceable priority, President Trump has decided to take the US out of the WHO, and that is a step in the wrong direction when it comes to preventing pandemics, spreading best practice, in particular in developing countries that need international assistance and skills. And they're the countries probably where future new viruses might well emerge, uncontrollable, and that spread easily. So hitting out at multilateral organizations is the wrong move, and the upshot could be counterproductive at global level, but in a catastrophic way, because if there is one issue that requires the spread of information and rapid responses to stop the emergence of contagious diseases, it is this one. I think there are two obvious examples of the usefulness of the WHO eradicating smallpox and cutting down on the number of cases of polio. So I think we need to call on the richer countries, EU countries, to offset the financial shortfall in the funding of the WHO as a result of the departure of the US. And let's hope that that is not followed up by other countries, that example.
Bicky.
Mr. Chair, dear colleagues. First, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to my dear friend Carmen Leite for her extremely important report entitled Long COVID and Access to the Right to Health. Why do we, her colleagues in the EPP group, consider this report important? Firstly, because today many people forget what a great trauma and socio-economic problem the COVID-19 pandemic was for societies around the world, and yet it was only 5 years ago. Secondly, today, those who struggle with long-term health problems after this terrible pandemic suffer in silence, and Carmen's report draws the attention of not only us parliamentarians, but also our public institutions to their suffering. Why else is it important? It is important because it contains specific recommendations on how to combat this serious social phenomenon, the long-term health effect of COVID-19 pandemic that affects our citizens. It talks about specific recommendations, including coordination of public policies regarding access to treatment of the long-term effects of COVID, providing appropriate funds for biomedical research, recognizing people affected by the long-term effects of COVID as people with disabilities, and improving the competence of medical staff in combating these effects. The conclusions from Carmen's report are crucial because, unfortunately, we believe it is likely that many similar situations may await us in the future, and that is why these recommendations on how to deal with the long-term effects of the pandemic are so important. Our neighbors, members of the European Parliament, who a few days ago established a new health committee that will, among other things, deal with the European Union's response to such health crises, also understands this. Carmen's very important report also shows this. Carmen, thank you very, very much again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Then we go to the other lists. Mrs. Madeira, you have the floor.
President, first of all, I would like to thank the rapporteur for such a relevant report with such a deep concern about health and socioeconomic impacts related with long COVID effects. This report is critical because, like we did in 2020, we need to recognize it exists and affects severely millions of people. This approach comes also assuming that after all constraints during COVID, we all came out with an overload of fragilities, and those have been clearly signaled in the following winters, with an increasing number of flus and respiratory diseases. In 2020, we protected ourselves because something deadly was out there, so we weakened several other immunities that we gain every day. Long COVID is a disability. It's a chronic state of illness that drastically reduces people's ability to work or produce. We knew nothing about SARS-CoV-2. The disease attacked quickly, swiftly, and we have to use containment techniques. We financed and created a vaccine in record time, the fastest vaccine of all times. Now, we are failing to help those who have been left with serious after effects that impact their quality of life and their role as professionals and our economy. This disease affects their self-esteem, their concentration, and ability to produce. A disease that perpetuates itself, growing almost invisibly, but very debilitating for those who suffer from it. Access to healthcare was what we tried to guarantee in pandemic times, never denying to anyone this right. It is now time to chart a course of action, like this report does, to ensure that this right is not denied to those left with after effects. This is our role with this report, and that's why we should, again, thank the rapporteur for bringing it to here. Thank you again.
Thank you. Then I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Munkachu.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Your badge, you have to put your badge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a difficult medical diagnostic differentiation between a long COVID and a syndrome post-vaccination. And if we look to the figures that the ICS meetings were only PhD professors about the vaccine adverse reaction, we found out that actually the figures looks like this. Following only Pfizer methodology, we found out that it's possible that in the world around between 15 and 17 million people died because of the vaccine. There are 50 million people who suffer disease that is disabling them. I mean, in other words, they are debilitated by these complications of the vaccine, and there is another in between 800 and 900 million people who have non-disabilitating syndrome after the vaccination. And one of the reasons I'm trying to explain to you that it's difficult to make a difference is the fact that some of the vaccine vials contain different elements. I give you an example. It's an mRNA vaccine, but in the process of fabrication of this vaccine, it has to be split from DNA. Now, in terminology, there is a certain quantity of DNA that is possible to be in those vials. Unfortunately, it was many, many times more. That's something that explains the turbo cancers that we have seen. In addition to that, in the vaccine, it was SV40, a component who should never be in that vaccine, and that's another reason for turbo cancers. Now, I can see that in policies of the government, they follow what they did during the pandemic. In other words, the Trusted News Initiative, which was a media decision to favor vaccination and sabotage the other means of treatment, it's still in place. So it's no longer a question, what is the long vaccine, the adverse reaction for the vaccine, and what is the long COVID? Because we have seen now complication in young people. And if you look to the statistic in the United States, people who are was covered by the life insurance, the situation is very dear. In other words, there is no explanation why we have young people dying or having complications from this vaccine. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I over.
Then I give the floor to Mr. Bügel.
Ja, besten Dank.
Yes, thank you very much, President. Distinguished colleagues, there don't tend to be many people here on a Friday morning, but it gives an opportunity to really listen to one another. And I welcome many of the statements I've heard. But first of all, what is long COVID exactly? It's still a little bit vague, nebulous. It describes a whole range of different symptoms that exist following on from a COVID infection and may occur months after initial infection. It can be compared to chronic fatigue syndrome or brain fog, as it's called. So we've got to get used to it and be aware of the fact that long COVID is not only a medical crisis, but also a social crisis. And I think the report makes a contribution to that realization. But as Baroness Brinton said, we can't forget the economy in all of this, because billions are being spent. And we've got to make sure that we improve research and we get people, get their lives back, get them back into the workplace, and try and get as many people out of the system as possible, out of the welfare system. I'm grateful to Sir Christopher as well as to Mr. Mongatta for saying this was something that was not touched on in the report, but is of course also an issue, and that is the implications, consequences of vaccination, and possibly not enough research has been done in that, and perhaps there is not much interest in certain circles of carrying out that kind of research. And so it's important that we include that as well, because as Ms. Moreira said, this was the fastest vaccine of all time. So in all probability, it was not the best vaccine of all time. And so I think that we've got to be aware of that, and we've got to deal with the consequences and make sure that we help those people who are suffering from long COVID as well as from the consequences of vaccination, post-vaccination syndrome. At the same time, however, the economy and member states have to invest in such a way as to make possible healing, reintegration, and make sure that we curb the consequences both of long COVID as also the post-vaccination syndrome and make sure that future generations do not suffer in the same way. That's what's important. Thank you very much.
Then I give the floor to Mr. Toraskai.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, what we are talking about here is the so-called long COVID, but we have never talked about the real cause of the COVID. We have never talked about those responsible for the COVID tragedy. The biggest flaw of this report is that it seeks to follow the protocol of the WHO, the World Health Organization. The protocol of that WHO, which has now been found to have been guilty of committing several mistakes and even crimes. The only question is whether these mistakes were committed because they were stupid or because an Ethiopian politician involved in shady deals is running the organization and he did what he did on purpose. The WHO is funded by global pharmaceutical companies belonging to Big Pharma and by Bill Gates, who made billions of euros out of the whole COVID story and the vaccines. How can we expect an impartial, objective opinion from them? It was under their pressure, for example, that Meta censored those who dared to claim from the beginning that it was not a natural virus. We, my party, had published this scientific fact based on the findings of Hungarian researchers. Still, we got censored by Meta. The leaders of Meta, or the WHO, also censored research doctors and scientists. Now that it no longer matters, now that these billionaires have made their profits, now that the official pandemic is over, now the truth can be told, we are no longer censored for it. However, the same doctors also say that mRNA vaccines have many more harmful side effects than they have been reported to have. This report does not deal with mRNA vaccines at all, even though not enough time has passed to declare that they don't cause any long-term damage to the human body. Today, we know that we have been lied to a lot about COVID, and that the WHO has often given us incorrect protocols. And yet, now we again intend to follow their advice on the so-called long COVID. My suggestion is that all member states should leave the WHO and follow the protocol of those research doctors who have now been proven to have been right about COVID in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Then I give the floor to Mr. Wiegel. Mr. Wiegel is not here? No. Okay, then we go to the next one. Mr. Chipouritis. Please.
Thank you very much. There's a clear tendency for escapism and wishful thinking all around us. In several areas, we are avoiding the challenges and difficulties. And while understandable on a private level in our societies where people sometimes simply want to have a moment of peace in a world of multi-crisis, the governments, the politicians, have a responsibility to face the challenges, not to run away from them. Long COVID is one of those challenges. A lot of our colleagues tend to ignore it as it reminds us about the polarizing politics of the pandemic, restrictions, uncertainty, and difficulties dealing with misinformation campaigns. For example, about the role of vaccines in modern medicine. Let me just state here that efficacy and safety of vaccines should be determined by research and researchers, not by social media and politicians. We would want to leave the divisive period in the past, but the COVID-19 is still here, and so is the long COVID, which is still not addressed at the level required. Yesterday, we talked about the need to strengthen the support for Ukraine in actions and not just words, and this requires expanding the defense spending to protect peace in Europe. I believe that should be our number one priority, that especially should not be lost to escapism. But I agree with the report that we also need to expand the healthcare services to provide the care needed. Without it, we would simply pay more in the future, including with the decreased quality of life. And it would be the people most vulnerable who would suffer the most. And we should also do more in prevention of long COVID, which includes research. There's a clear need for cooperation, and therefore strengthening the World Health Organization is a necessity. To defend human rights, we have to defend the right to healthy life, and this report is clearly guiding us on how to fulfill this responsibility. I thank the reporter for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we go to Mrs. Bilozir. You have to insert your badge.
Chers collègues, je tiens à...
Dear colleagues, I'd like to thank Ms. Carmen Leiter for her important work on this report. Long COVID is not only a health problem, it's also a human rights issue. Today, we have the opportunity of improving the lives of millions of people. The COVID pandemic caused some 7 million deaths worldwide, but the effects of COVID didn't stop there. In Europe, there are at least 22 million people who today are suffering from long COVID. And they are experiencing difficulties when it comes to access to appropriate health care and are facing financial difficulties. And research has shown that some groups are more at risk than others. Women, people with a serious form of COVID, in particular those in hospital or persons who had a previous medical condition, and also the elderly. And that is why we need a human rights-based approach. And that means guaranteeing diagnoses, appropriate treatment, and social support for the people concerned. It's also essential that more research be carried out, because we still don't have a clear definition of what constitutes long COVID. And without that, access to health care is even more difficult. Now, Ukraine knows to what extent access to health care and the protection of human rights are crucial, in particular in times of war. And in spite of the fact that we're fighting for our freedom, we're also having to face up to the consequences of COVID. So we support this resolution because we believe it reflects our own values. That's to say, protecting the most vulnerable, guaranteeing access to health care, and defending fundamental rights. I think it is essential that long COVID be recognized as a disability in the context of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I therefore call on all members of this Assembly to vote in favor of this resolution, because its recommendations will only be effective if governments, of course, agree to act on them. So we need a real commitment on the part of authorities and our health systems with a view to obtaining tangible results. So we need to act, and act now. Thank you.
Merci. And now I give the floor to Mrs. Osler.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank the rapporteur for her work in drafting this report and its timely focus on long COVID, a medical condition that affects millions of people around the world. The British medical journal The Lancet estimated that as of March 2023, at least 65 million people were struggling with long COVID. More recent estimates now put this figure in the hundreds of millions of people whose lives have been entirely disrupted by the condition. The authors of a recent research paper found that long COVID drastically affects patients' well-being and sense of self, as well as their ability to work, socialize, care for others, manage chores, and engage in community activities. The Chief Science Advisor of Canada acknowledged this in a September 2024 report. She found that long COVID continues to have a broad socioeconomic impact on affected individuals and their families. Multiple other studies have confirmed these findings. One study found that over 1 in 5 Canadians with long COVID missed multiple days of work or school as a result. In numerous cases, employees in some countries have been forced to resign their positions. Unsurprisingly, individuals struggling with long COVID frequently experience financial hardship, resulting in depleted savings and economic and food insecurity. A 2024 report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, found that even conservative estimates of long COVID indicate that it may be reducing the workforce by nearly 3 million employees within OECD countries, resulting in at least 138 billion euros in lost wages alone. Furthermore, this same report stressed that long COVID threatens to exacerbate the inequalities laid bare by the pandemic, especially amongst populations made vulnerable. The impact of long COVID on healthcare systems has also been significant. One study estimated that the total burden of long COVID to the Canadian healthcare system at between 8 to 51 billion Canadian dollars per year. In view of the far-reaching health and societal impacts of long COVID, it has been argued that more robust government responses, including more services, supports, and research funding, are required to counter negative impacts. But the global science community has raised alarms over Canada's southern neighbour, who has pulled out of the World Health Organization and stopped all activity in their federal science funding agencies, meaning a freezing of grant review panels, no new research funding, layoffs of scientists, and a stoppage of all external health communications. Colleagues, this is not the time to neglect health security, not least for persons suffering from long COVID. Thank you for your attention. Miigwech, merci.
Bravo. Thank you. Then finally go to Mrs. Voxy. You have the floor. Yes, please insert your card.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I extend my sincerest congratulations to Ms. Leet for this excellent report on long COVID. Studying COVID-19, its long-term consequences is essential, and I commend the dedication for shedding light in this crucial issue. COVID-19 pandemic has left devastating consequences worldwide. In Albania, the impact has been severe. We even brought tanks in the street to fight COVID, and this is not a joke. According to a European Union report, during COVID period, Albania recorded the number of deaths twice as the average of EU member countries. The reasons should be carefully analyzed. Delayed responses, mismanagement, lack of knowledge, lack of financial support for treatments, inadequate healthcare measures, all of this should be analyzed. It's important to know now in order to react. Today, we see people suffer and even die without a clear explanation. Many suspect long COVID plays a major role, yet recognition is low. Research is lacking and there is no proper response. If we fail to act with knowledge, coordination, and urgently, we risk ignoring another health crisis. As this report highlights, long COVID is a complex condition affecting millions worldwide. It causes chronic fatigue, brain fog, respiratory and cardiovascular issues lasting for months or years. Without clear definition and standard diagnosis, medical responses remain inadequate. What are the challenges? Patients suffering from long COVID have nowhere to turn, no specialized care, no financial assistance, and no national strategy. Many remain undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, or ignored. So it's a call for action mentioned in this report. The report provides clear recommendation that we must act on immediately. Recognize long COVID as public health crisis and include in national healthcare strategies, invest in healthcare infrastructure, train medical professionals to diagnose and treat long COVID properly, ensure financial support, including medical reimbursement and disability recognition, strengthen international cooperation. As a conclusion, as the report states, the pandemic is not over. It has transformed into a chronic crisis. If we do not act now, more lives will be lost, more families will suffer, and economies will continue to struggle. Albania and other countries must learn from the past mistakes and take science-based, coordinated action. It is our duty to ensure that no one suffers in silence and that those affected receive recognition, treatment, and support they deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we concluded our list of speakers, and I call now Ms. Leith as rapporteur to reply, and you have 3 minutes, please.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, President, and thank you to all of the speakers who took the floor for their contributions, and I can assure you that I listened to all of you very carefully indeed. This is obviously the case, and I think that everybody basically agreed that this is a report that needs to be put into practice. But I do want to pick up on something that some speakers said, not all fully supportive of the report, but remind you that this pandemic upended the world. Many of us were confined in our countries. I mean, it varied from country to country, but we saw our neighbors, our friends, and even family members dying. Now, the vaccine was record-breaking. All of the researchers who were familiar with this issue were able to achieve this collective success, which was vaccination. Now, of course, there were some problems with vaccines, as is always the case with other vaccines. I mean, some people are allergic to some of the components or ingredients of vaccines, and I mean, that applies to all vaccines. Let me make that clear. But that does not mean that this was going too far in the case of COVID. Now, we've talked about the World Health Organization. The WHO, of course, brings together doctors from all countries around the world, leading researchers in their own countries. I mean, I'm sure that you have also got doctors from your countries in the WHO. I mean, I can tell you, when it comes to Spain, they're the best of the best. And we believe that the WHO is absolutely crucial in the fight against pandemics, as well as trying to tackle health problems in underdeveloped countries. And, you know, if they didn't have the WHO, then they really would be worse off. The underdeveloped countries. And of course, you know, a great deal has been written about COVID, and that is why in this report we are calling for research to continue into COVID. We are calling for funding for such research, and make sure that all people, all of our citizens who are suffering the consequences of long COVID, I mean, you've had their jobs affected, their personal lives affected. We need to make sure that we reassert their rights, make sure that they are covered by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that they're recognized as having a disability, make sure they have welfare payments, compensation, and also that we have properly adapted labor rights. So that's all really, President. The important thing here is that we protect these patients. I mean, these people are our neighbors, they're our family members, and other people whom we don't know, but who are nevertheless suffering. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Ms. Leith. And then I just have to ask to Saskia Kluit if she wants to speak as president of the committee. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. When we were preparing this report, I very often had to think about my good friend's daughter, Luna. I know Luna for all her life. She's 27, and she attracted COVID and went from an extremely vibrant social person working in child's healthcare to a person that is now almost full-time at home. She lost her job. She has to sleep every 2 hours, and although she's an extremely positive person and tries to make the best of it, it's for me so clear that she's lost most of the space in her life and her social life. And I'm also extremely proud of her because she's still a very positive person fighting to get well again. And I think it's very good that in this meeting that we all agree upon long COVID, at least as being an extremely serious disease. So let's be happy for that at least. And she's not alone, millions others have it. And I want to thank Carmen and the committee for doing this wonderful job on this report. A human rights approach is very important to treating long COVID. It touches upon the heart of the Article 11 of our European Social Charter that enshrines the right to protection of health. And long COVID is of course not alone. This is a disease like many other post-virus diseases. In the Netherlands we have the Q fever, we have ME, and all those diseases deserve recognition as a disability so we can find good treatment plans and financial repairs when patients are not able to work anymore. And I think it's extremely important that we also mention the role of the WHO. Carmen already mentioned it also. It's a high-level organization with very, very dedicated and qualified people in it, but also extremely important in fighting existing and new diseases like COVID. We have diseases around the corner, people. We have the monkeypox, we have the bird flu flying around, and it's the WHOs that will protect us by early warnings and early signaling, and also alerting other nations so we can prepare nationally and help new patients. So we should underline their important work here, especially now that the USA has retracted for them. And I would say to all of us here, when we come home on Monday morning, let's work in our governments to fill the financial gap that the US has made. All right, then we go to the practicalities. The report was unanimously adopted because we think it's a wonderful report, and no resolutions has been tabled, so also our colleagues think it's a wonderful report. So I think we can go to the vote now.
Thank you, Mrs. Kleutz. So I can close the debate. And indeed, as you said, the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development has presented a draft resolution to which no amendments have been tabled. And so we can proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 16088. And in fact, a simple majority is required. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. 32 are in favor, 3 against, and 1 abstention. Congratulations. The draft resolution and document 16088 is adopted. So then we can go to the next item of business this morning. That's the debate on the report by Ms. Andrea Eder-Gitzthaler, titled Overcoming Age-Based Discrimination Against Older Persons, which is document 16091, presented by Ms. Petra Bayer on behalf of the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination. We have to finish at 12 o'clock, so I will enter the list of speakers at about 11:50, but when I see here the list, I think it will be no problem, so that we have also the time to reply and to vote. I will just wait 1 more minute so that everyone can take his or find his final place. And once again, I want to congratulate Ms. Carmen Leite from Spain for your wonderful report.
Vous faites un rappel au règlement. C'est pas, it's not.
Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just too late to vote, so I would like to add my positive vote to the COVID-19 report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dallas. Well noted as this. Thank you. Is everyone ready? Yeah? Okay. So then I call Mr. Bayer. You have 7 minutes, and then of course you have 10 minutes at the end to reply to the debate. Mr. Bayer, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Andrea Eder-Kitzstahler, who is the rapporteur of this very important report to protect the human rights of older persons, regrets that she can't be here with us today, but she is for half a year chairing the Federal Council of the Austrian Parliament, and they have sittings this week, and so I will do my best to present her report on the overcoming age-based discrimination against older persons. So let me start with the obvious, and the obvious is that older persons really contribute a lot to our society. They have essential functions, especially when it comes to families, where they often take care about kids or grandkids, and guaranteeing that they can fully and equally enjoy all the human rights and fundamental freedoms means respecting the principles of independence, participation, self-fulfillment, dignity, and non-discrimination. So I think the issue to deal with older persons is especially pressing because we see that our societies are aging and there are more and more older persons that are part of our societies, and as Andrea's report rightly say, human rights should not be denied or reduced with age. But unfortunately, this often is still the case. So we need to overcome specific barriers and that older people are facing, realizing their rights. They include fails, but often socially accepted narratives of older people being sick or dependent or passive, which is of course also then published widely by some media. Ageism is a widely prevalent and prejudicial attitude resting on the assumption that the neglect of older persons and discrimination against them is acceptable, which is of course not. And ageism is a driving force behind age-based discrimination. According to the WHO, the World Health Organization, half of the population have some ageist attitudes about older persons, which reflects stereotypes and prejudices and discrimination against them. And I think it's really important to change the situation and change the way we consider and treat older persons. That means a change in mentalities and cultures in our society so that ageism and discrimination would no longer be accepted and justified. But, and that's quite surprising, there is no explicit guarantee against being a subject to discrimination or discriminatory treatment based on ageism, and no explicit obligation on member states, on states in general, to take active measures against ageism and its discriminatory consequences. However, states have an obligation to address ageism because it amounts to discrimination on the basis of age, and some treaties oblige states to eliminate discrimination on the basis of so-called other status, as for instance the European Convention of Human Rights, and this other status of course also includes age. Indeed, age is less protected than other grounds of discrimination, and there is a broad range of circumstances where age may constitute a legitimate reason for distinguishing between different groups of persons. I just want to remind you that we often see discrimination against older persons when it comes to insurance, banking, employment, access to healthcare, and many others, which do not apply to other non-discrimination grounds. So we need to face the fact that the unequal treatment of older persons is the most accepted form of discrimination, and that it takes place in a variety of contexts and policies. Ageism against older persons is trivialized as a less harmful or less important form of discrimination, which leads to older persons themselves internalizing stereotypes and ageism. There is indeed scientific evidence that the impact of age-based discrimination is there in physical and mental health of older persons. One of the main recommendations in the draft resolution before you, and I really want to ask you to support it, is the need for the Council of Europe member states to strengthen the legal and policy frameworks following a human rights-based approach and expand the prohibition of unequal treatment based on age to all areas of life. We have many legal and policy tools to tackle ageism against older persons, including the European Social Charter and the Committee of Ministers recommendation from the year 2014, with measures to protect the human rights of older persons. Some of them need to be fully applied, while others need to be reviewed and updated. So this report supports the adoption of also of a global convention on the rights of older persons, as many of the biases against old persons are embedded in law. As regards action by our member states, we need to raise awareness and provide training on on age-based discrimination, in particular targeting lawyers and judges. Of course, we also need research and data collection should make them a priority. This report addresses access to justice, health, care, the goods and services, as well as the need for more and better participation of older persons in the decisions and policies that affect them, and not just those who affect them, but all they are dealing with. There are fundamental rights that need to be guaranteed on which discrimination against older persons exists today, and they should be eradicated. The rapporteur calls attention on the growing use of artificial intelligence in health and social care for older persons, and Andrea Ida-Kitzstahler believes that artificial intelligence can be beneficial in identifying risks and enabling older people to meet their own needs. However, for this work, implicit and explicit biases of ageism must be eliminated in the design, development, use and evaluation of AI technology. And to conclude, on behalf of Andrea Ida-Kitzstahler and also as a member of the Equality and Non-Discrimination Committee, I would ask you to support this report, which we unanimously adopted in the Equality Committee yesterday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kitzstahler. And then I go to the speakers on behalf of Madame Bayer. Sorry, I was using the wrong name, but it's okay. Thank you, Ms. Bayer. And now we go to the speakers on behalf of the political groups. I start with Sir Chope. You have 3 minutes.
Mr. President, thank you. I think that the description older person can be quite patronising, and I don't know whether I fit into the definition or not. But what I do think is that this report has got some good points in it, and I'd like to address particularly paragraph 3 of the draft resolution, which refers to this. It says, older persons experience age-based discrimination in all areas of life, especially in the workplace. And I'm going to illustrate the point here of double standards. In the United Kingdom Parliament, nobody who works in the Parliament is the subject of any age discrimination. Unfortunately, in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, age discrimination is rife because people who work here are not allowed to work beyond a specified retirement age. And the consequence of that is that those people, even if they wish to work for longer, are prevented by this Human Rights Assembly from being able to exercise the right to work beyond the specified age, which I think is 60. And in practical terms, this means that somebody like Dr. Gunther Schirmer, to whom I wish to pay tribute because this is his last day working for our Parliamentary Assembly. He's been the head of department at the Legal Affairs and Human Rights, and I've had the privilege of working with him for many, many years, including the time when I was chair of the Legal Affairs and Human Rights Committee. I don't know whether Dr. Sharma would wish to stay on beyond his birthday this week and his enforced retirement or not. But what I do condemn is the fact he has not got the choice of being able to choose to work longer. And I find it extraordinary that the Equalities Committee is prepared to tolerate such a situation at home. As we say in the United Kingdom, physician, heal thyself. And that's what this Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe needs to do. We need to remove this unnecessary discrimination against older people in the workplace, which is being practiced here to the detriment of the Assembly, in my view, and of its employees. And so let us pay tribute to the work of Dr. Sharma for years and years and years, and perhaps it won't be long before we can have what's called a Sharma resolution, which will remove age discrimination from employees of this Assembly.
Thank you. Then I go to Madame Fresco-Rolfo.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le groupe
Thank you, President. ALDE would like to salute the remarkable piece of work done by our rapporteur and a subject that she deals with such commitment concerns us all, or will end up concerning all of us. Her report, I think, highlights an important problem, the prejudices, stereotypes and discriminatory attitudes towards people as a result of their age. Ageism takes various forms. At the workplace, for example, fewer professional prospects, less possibilities for contributing to ongoing training, for example. A study was carried out in the US amongst 913 women managers and how they suffer as a result of their age, too young before 40, burdened with family responsibilities between 40 and 60, and considered to be old after 50. Ageism can lead to senses of worthlessness, personal depreciation, loss of confidence, self-confidence, whilst diminishing a sense of personal motivation. Media, while associating age with images of solitude and weakness, contribute to enhance these stereotypes. These biased representations influence societal perceptions, further exacerbating the isolation of the elderly, with lasting consequences on the mental and physical well-being. And in that context, it's difficult not to mention the excellent report by Madame Edith Estrella on the digital divide, and I think the finding in that report is an alarming one. Perhaps I can move on now to another subject. I do apologize. I seem to have lost a page somewhere. But any restrictions necessary for the purposes of production should only be implemented once the person concerned has been heard by a judge. There's too much abuse. People are deprived of their freedom. That continues and calls for constant vigilance. In that respect, recommendation of the Committee of Ministers of Member States rightly underlines that Member States should adopt legislation enabling the elderly to put their affairs in order in the event that they might become incapable of expressing their wishes at a later stage. I'm still missing one page. I do apologize for that, says the speaker.
On va faire
So I think it is important that people be heard by a judge, the elderly be heard by a judge before a guardian is appointed. It's a question of self-determination, which, of course, is important if they are to be able to continue to play an active part in life in society. I think we need to encourage states to promote intergeneration inclusion through exchange platforms, promoting mutual understanding and cooperation between various ages. The initiatives that are referred to would strengthen social ties, reduce stereotypes, and enrich our societies. The experience of the elderly, of course, is an asset that cannot be replaced, and it's important that it be handed on, their experience and knowledge be handed on to future generations.
Dear colleagues, first I would like to thank the rapporteur for this excellent report. Unfortunately, No Country for Old Men is not just a movie title by the Coen brothers. It reflects a saddening reality. Ageism is a widespread problem worldwide that affects older people in many different ways. There are valuable works that highlight the vulnerability of older people, who are subject to both social prejudice and structural discrimination. For older women, the situation is even more serious. For example, many older women in Turkey, despite having worked all their lives, are excluded from the social security system. Insufficient pensions drive them into poverty and social exclusion, especially those women who get divorced, who do not receive adequate social support. At the same time, society places unrealistic expectations on aging, especially on women. The pressure to stay young means that concealing one's age becomes the ultimate compliment. A group of women in Turkey once published an encouraging book to deal with those expectations and to be in peace with their age, a book called Women Who Show Their Age, in which they challenge this view. Overcoming ageism starts with rejecting this pressure and accepting the natural process of aging. Furthermore, ageism is not limited to older people. Young people are also marginalized due to their perceived lack of experience. Aging, while often overlooked, is no less significant as a dimension of discrimination, as an intersectional issue. It can take on a deeply oppressive character when combined with other forms of discriminations. Being a woman, LGBT+, a migrant, a minority, or living in poverty can make old age an even heavier burden. Compounding social exclusion and vulnerability, recognizing ageism as part of a broader system of discrimination is essential to addressing its full impact and ensuring dignity and equality for all. Age discrimination must therefore be combated at all stages of life. By valuing knowledge, experience, and the dignity of the individual, we can create a more inclusive society. A society that doesn't discriminate against its members on the basis of age, but ensures their rights, well-being, and full participation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Then I give the floor now to Mrs. Bangoglu.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the rapporteur for her excellent report. And dear colleagues, aging is a significant global trend reshaping societies around the world. By 2030, the world's population aged 65 and older is expected to outpace the younger population, and this increase is expected to be faster in developing countries. One of the most critical challenges related to demographic change is age discrimination, which is just as damaging as any other forms of bias. Older individuals face age-related discrimination in various aspects of life, particularly in employment, as well as in accessing services, education, and healthcare. So changing how we think, feel, and act towards age and aging enables us to develop the capabilities of older people through providing integrated policies and ensuring access to long-term care. One of the most important gaps regarding age discrimination is the lack of disaggregated data. There is a need to collect data for the inclusion of older people, especially in the economic and employment fields, as well as on wages, incentives, and insurance processes. Discrimination takes place in recruitment processes, workplace conditions, and in the economic field. Older individuals mostly face difficulties obtaining credit, insurance, and banking services due to age-related biases. So reviewing and improving legislation to prohibit this kind of age-based discrimination is critical to ensuring access to these services. Another point is that older women retire with smaller pensions and savings due to the lower lifetime earnings on unpaid caregiving roles. With a low salary, this leads them to curtail their health expenditures, access to housing, and to disengage from social life. Member States should act against age discrimination, in particular the improvement of their rights to social protection, so inclusion to social life. We therefore, as stipulated in the report, strongly support establishing a legal instrument at the European level to protect older persons' rights, preparing a recommendation to prevent and combat ageism, joining UN Human Rights Council discussions on developing a legally binding instruments on the rights of older persons. Considering older persons' rights as expense to society undermines their dignity and disregards their contributions to society. Older persons must be recognized as independent right holders rather than passive beneficiaries of care. A right-based approach is essential to challenge these misconceptions and promote policies that protect and empower older individuals, ensuring their full participation in society. So combating ageism as against all forms of discrimination is a human rights obligation. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I give the floor to Mrs. Hoxie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to congratulate the rapporteur, Ms. Eder Gitzschaller, for the report and a very interesting and important issue. Today, we are addressing this issue immediately after we discussed the long COVID, both reports that are interlinked with each other. What we are discussing is the age-based discrimination. The motto of UN in the last years has been leave no one behind. But in the case of older people, many of them are left aside and many behind. Ageism is deeply embedded in our societies, marginalizing older persons and limiting their access to essential services, economic opportunities, and participation in public life. Instead of recognizing their invaluable contribution, too often they are seen as a burden. This report highlights urgent need for a paradigm shift, one that views older persons as right holders, as active citizens rather than passive recipients of care. Discrimination against older persons exists in many forms, many obstacles as explained in the report, in employment barriers, in exclusion of digital services, lack of access in health services, and lack of financial support, etc. All this prevents them from fully participating in the society. In the first debate of today's session, we discussed COVID and long COVID, which have widened the inequalities even more and have done them even more visible, as many older individuals were denied equal access to medical treatment. The digital divide further isolates them, making it harder to access government services and maintain independence. In Albania, the challenges faced by older persons are particularly severe. The country has a rapidly aging population, but social support system remains weak. In the last decade, over 1 million Albanians left the country, 75% of them young, talented, excellent professionals. So young and active population is leaving. The migration of younger generation abroad has left many older persons without family support, increasing their vulnerability. This makes their parents, elders remain alone without care. Many elderly citizens struggle with low pensions, inadequate health care, and social isolation, especially in the rural areas. Additionally, the digitalization of services has created barriers for those without access to technology or skills to use it. As the report mentions, All countries must prioritize age-inclusive policies, strengthen social protection systems, and invest in accessible healthcare and public services to ensure that its elderly population can live with dignity and independence. To combat age-based discrimination, we must implement strong legal framework, enforce anti-discrimination policies, and promote intergenerational solidarity. Let us stand together in creating an inclusive society where dignity, equality, and respect for older persons are upheld at every stage of life. Thank you.
Thank you. So we close the list of speakers on behalf of political groups. I go now to the other speakers list. I go first to Mrs. Ilic. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, older persons are valuable members of our societies, representing the pillars of wisdom, and they deserve our due attention in our capacities as policymakers. I would like to congratulate Madam Rapporteur for her important work. Older persons are not merely beneficiaries of care, they are active participants of the society. Despite this invaluable contribution, many older persons are denied their fundamental human rights. This age-based discrimination manifests in stereotypes, societal neglect, and treating them as burdens rather than stakeholders in progress. One important point is gerontophobia, or the fear of aging and older people. Combating this hurtful phenomenon involves challenging cliches, fostering empathy, and promoting intergenerational connections. Education about the natural aging process and the value of older individuals can help dismantle negative perceptions. Practicing self-acceptance and mindfulness around one's own aging journey, as well as seeking therapy if needed, can also address underlying anxieties and promote a more positive outlook on aging. Many older people face challenges in accessing financial services due to prejudice about their technological skills, productivity, or perceived risks. In healthcare systems, older persons often experience rationing of care or ignore due to biases that gives importance to younger demographics. They also frequently encounter barriers in public transportation, housing, and digital services. Possible protections against the widely varying nature of age-based discriminations have to be just as diversified. We must put into place legal provisions that prohibit and penalize discrimination based on age. We must hold private companies to account and make them include policies that help ease the life of older persons in their services. We must create social systems that focus on inclusion of persons of all ages. We must make sure that older persons not only do not get discriminated against in healthcare, but that they are duly provided with the care they needed. Each of us, whether as policymakers, community leaders, or citizens, has a role to play in creating a society where age is celebrated, not stigmatized. Let us remember that dignity and respect are not privileges for the young, but rights for all. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we go to Mr. Francis.
Thank you, Speaker. Honourable colleagues, as highlighted in the Rapporteur's report, age-based discrimination against older persons is a reality. As a result, elderly people often find themselves discredited, even dehumanized in some cases, and thus excluded from society because of their age. At least this is a phenomenon increasingly observed in Western societies. However, this reality is not shared by several nations and communities outside the Western world, and even some within it. In Canada, Indigenous peoples have a different perspective and understanding of the value and role played by our elders as important knowledge keepers. Nevertheless, the importance of our elders is not simply a matter of age and experience as knowledge keepers, but also of their contribution to individual and community wellness. In fact, we recognize that Indigenous elders are essential to supporting the wellness not only of elders themselves, but also of individuals and communities, as well as intergenerational solidarity. The role of our elders is intergenerational solidarity is crucial to fostering mutual help between generations to ensure that each receives from the other. In addition, the wisdom of older generations can address contemporary issues. As an example, Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall introduced the concept of two-eyed seeing. He defines this as learning to see from one eye with the strengths of indigenous knowledges and the ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of mainstream knowledges and the ways of knowing, and to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. It is both a methodological framework and a guiding principle, as it emphasizes the need to cohabit and take the time to learn from each other's reality in order to work together. Ironically, two-eyed seeing, as developed by Elder Albert Marshall, could inform the discussion today, as the understanding and importance of elders to Indigenous peoples could shed light on and contribute to the proposed resolutions called for a human rights-based approach to challenge ageism against older persons to guarantee equality, dignity, autonomy, and participation at all stages of life. In today's current context characterized by aging of Western populations and the devaluation and even discrimination against elders in the West, Indigenous perspectives on older generations could be a wisdom that Western societies could do well to examine for inspiration. I am pleased to have had the opportunity to share with you all a small part of this important aspect of my culture, and I would like to thank the rapporteur for this excellent report. Walalan, thank you, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. So we can conclude the list of speakers, and I call Ms. Bayer to reply. You have 3 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that all or most of your interventions showed the urgency to tackle ageism against older persons and fully protect the rights of older persons in our member states everywhere. This is also about building inclusive and cohesive societies and intergenerational links and also solidarity among generations. Andrea Eder-Kitzstahler, and I will tell her back home in Austria that many of you praised her for her work. Indeed, she will be happy about that. Andrea asked me to pass some messages to you ahead of the voting. And I think also these messages are quite in line with that what was said. She says, it's time to act. It's high time for a paradigm shift. And she calls this organization and its member state to defend the rights of older people and give them the opportunity to develop and use their talents. I think that's really key. The draft recommendation before you calls for a review of the implementation of the Committee of Ministers' recommendation from the year 2014 to promote human rights of older people and combat age-related discrimination. And she says that the Council of Europe needs to work actively to protect and promote the human rights of older persons as part of its anti-discrimination activities and also as regards the implementation of the European Social Charter. Seniors must be treated as right holders and guaranteed equality, dignity, autonomy and participation at all stages of life. This report calls for equality and anti-discrimination laws and policies to combat the existing structural discrimination against older persons in all our countries. The rapporteur prepared a draft resolution and draft recommendation, which are before you now. And on behalf of Andrea Eder-Kitzstahler, I would like to ask you to cast a positive report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bayer. So the debate is now closed. The Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination has presented a draft resolution to which 8 amendments have been tabled and a draft recommendation to which no amendments have been tabled. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that Amendment 7 to the draft resolution, which was unanimously approved by the committee, be declared as approved. Is that so, Ms. Bayer? Okay, thank you. If no one objects, I will consider the amendments to be approved. Is there any objection? No, thank you. Then I understand that Amendment 7 to the draft resolution is therefore approved and will not be called. So then we go to the amendments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8 to the draft resolution, which were rejected by the committee with a 2/3 majority, be declared as definitely rejected. Is that so, Mr. Bayer? Thank you. Well, obviously following the rules, yes, but you can say it, no problem. If no one objects, I will consider the amendments rejected. Is there an objection? No. So this means that amendments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8 to the draft resolutions are therefore rejected and will not be called. And we will now then proceed to the vote on the, yes, on the draft resolution contained in document 16091 as amended, and a simple majority is required. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. And it's 32 in favor, unanimously. Congratulations to the rapporteur. So the draft resolution and document 16091 as amended is adopted. Now we have the draft recommendation. We will now proceed to vote on the draft recommendation contained in document 16091, to which no amendments have been tabled. A 2/3 majority is required, so the vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Also unanimously, so this means that the draft recommendation in document 16091 is adopted. Congratulations to the rapporteur. Now, now I will give the floor back to the President. Mr. President, what happened to your I follow with my bike. This can happen, eh? Yeah.
You have to take your buds. I always forget my buds. Dear colleagues, we come now to the free debate. I remind members that this debate is for topics not already on the agenda, agreed on Monday morning. Speaking time will be limited to 3 minutes, as usual. The free debate will be finished at 12:55 p.m. So I call first the leader of the Liberal Democrats group, Mr. Julian Boulay, to take the floor. Mr. Boulay.
Thank you so much, President. I didn't expect to speak first. I want to congratulate you for your re-election. You've had a great performance as President of the Assembly in 2024, and on behalf of the Liberals, I wish you good luck and wisdom to chair this Assembly with strength, ambitious and courage in order to deliver for the whole European continent in terms of our 3 main values. Now, there is a great and exciting year waiting for us. We'll be having elections in Kosovo, and on behalf of the Liberals, I have to share with you my hope that after this moment, the country would be accepted as a full member of Council of Europe. We'll also have this year, in May, elections in Poland, and I really hope that this will be a moment of reconciliation of this country that needs to reassure its European path and step aside from radical extreme right tendencies that we have seen so far. And what goes on now in Poland in terms of direction is good. It needs to be continued. I would also like to speak on the Romanian situation, as I'm, of course, Romanian, and I really hope that during the coming presidential elections, there will be no state interference into our presidential elections in order to modify the election results if that would not convene the government parties. We'll be having elections in Albania, and I hope this is an opportunity for Mr. Edi Rama to understand that Albania belongs to the European continent with its future and its background, and we should work together on strengthening Albania's tie with both the European Union and also with the Council of Europe. Now, at the end of my speech, I would like to say that I'm very happy that we have, with a great majority of votes, ratified the credentials of the Georgian delegation, and that we have reiterated our call on the release of the 55 political prisoners of Georgia. We have asked them to refrain from violence on people protesting in the streets, and we have also asked them to be willing to announce new elections during the coming months. I think that these are very reasonable elements that we have almost in unanimity agreed upon, and I really hope that by the end of April we'll have a clearer situation and a renewal of the Georgian engagement for its European path and its commitments to the values of the Council of Europe. I wish everyone a fantastic year, and I wish you, Mr. President, again, lots of good luck for the huge amount of work that is about to come on your shoulders. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President of the Liberal Democrats, and personally thank you for your wishes, your nice words, and of course for supporting me being elected for the second time as the President of this Assembly. Allow me to thank not only you personally, but all colleagues being present, because usually Friday is a day very difficult for everybody. I understand that most of the parliamentarians have to go back to their parliaments. For example, all the Greek delegation is back because today they are voting for the new president of the Hellenic Republic. I had the ability as a president of the Assembly, and I was allowed to send a ballot through mail. But it is very important to stay until Friday, and really thanks, Mr. President, and all the colleagues who are present. I believe that this idea of having again the free debate is an interesting idea which will help to improve our works, because of course we have the program, we put all issues which have been decided by the Presidential Committee and the Bureau in the program. But on the other hand, we have to give the ability to those who want to say something that pops up suddenly during the week, and elaborate and give their perspective on major issues. So thanks for raising all issues which are very important, especially election procedures this year. Now, next is our colleague Vlad Batrincea from the United European Left. Paul, would you like to say something on behalf of it? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I want to wish you well and congratulate you again on your re-election. You're doing an excellent job, and I know that this Assembly is in very good hands for the coming year. In this, my final contribution to this Assembly, I want to raise the failure of this institution to address the long-standing injustice and repression meted out to the Kurdish people. Throughout my 7 years of attending this institution, I've seen the courageous men and women outside this building who keep a constant vigil for Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the Kurdish freedom movement, who will have been imprisoned on Imrali Island for 26 years next month. For most of this time, he's been denied prison visits and even access to his lawyers. He truly is the Nelson Mandela of the Kurdish people. And Mr. President, there are signs of hope right now. It has been revealed that the Turkish government has been engaged in a talks process in recent times. Dialogue is crucial, but for real negotiations to take place, Erdogan must have the courage to release Öcalan, to enable him to approach these talks from a position of dignity and fairness. I am also calling on the Turkish government to stop bombing and killing civilians in the autonomous administration of northeast Syria. We simply have not addressed that issue at all. The situation in Syria is very uncertain. The new HTS regime, which has its roots in ISIS, has been welcomed by the West, and there will be few tears for Assad, but the early signs are not promising. The insistence of introducing Islamic training for the police force, the refusal to appoint even one woman or anyone from any other political party to the new government does not bode well. This is why Öcalan's vision for a grassroots, democratic, multi-ethnic society based on tolerance, inclusion and equality is needed in the region now more than ever. Erdogan must also stop deposing democratically elected mayors in Turkey, stop harassing Kurdish citizens, and stop arresting journalists. All of these activities fly in the face of the principles of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Colleagues, there is an opportunity now for a brighter future across this region, but it can only come about through the inclusion of the Kurdish freedom movement. The Council of Europe needs to step up now and play a positive role in defending the human rights of all peoples in this region. Freedom for Öcalan and freedom for the Kurdish people.
I want to thank Mr. Paul Gavan, who spoke on behalf of the United European Left, and of course for his kind words. Thank you, Paul. Now I call Mr. Yunus Emre on behalf of the Socialists, Greens and Democrats.
First of all, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, for your re-election and wish you success in this important position. Dear colleagues, the topic of our session is free debate, but I want to inform you about some people I know in my country, Turkey, who are not free. You are all well aware of Osman Kavala, who remains imprisoned despite 2 rulings by the European Court of Human Rights, and our assemblies call for his immediate release. Similarly, Selahattin Demirtas, the former co-chair of Turkey's 3rd largest political party, remains imprisoned despite the European Court of Human Rights decision. Additionally, Can Atalay, who was elected as an MP, is still behind bars. The Constitutional Court of Turkey has ruled that he must be released and assume his parliamentary duties, yet this ruling remains unimplemented. Yes, colleagues, you heard it right. Can Atalay, a lawyer who has dedicated his life to fighting injustice, remains in prison despite the Constitutional Court decision. While these individuals are awaiting with hope to be released, there have been new and alarming developments in recent days. First, 2 mayors from my party were removed from office and imprisoned. The practice of appointing government trustees to replace elected mayors continues in many cities. Additionally, multiple investigations have been launched against the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu. Today, İmamoğlu is at the prosecutor's office to give a statement as a part of new investigation. The citizens who went to the courthouse with him for solidarity waited at the entrance are chanting a slogan from Turkey's democracy history. There is no salvation alone, either all together or none of us. Moreover, Ümit Özdağ, a former academic, former MP, and leader of an important political party, has also been arrested and sent to prison. In my country, where we read news about investigations against journalists almost daily, a shocking development occurred just yesterday. Suat Toktaş, the editor-in-chief of one of Turkey's most prominent TV channels, Halk TV, was arrested simply for practicing journalism. He is one of the most professional and ethically committed journalists in Turkey. I cannot accept that a journalist is imprisoned just for doing his job. We will do everything in our power to end this injustice as soon as possible. Our session will soon conclude, and I, like you, will return to my country. One of the first things I will do upon my return is to visit Suat Toktaş, whom I am proud to be a friend. We will continue our struggle for a country where journalists, academics, and politicians are not imprisoned. Thank you.
Thank you, Yunus. And I'm going to give now the floor to Madame Albana Boksi, who will speak on behalf of the European People's Party, and I welcome her in our assembly. It is the first time, as far as I know.
you very much, dear Mr. President, and let me add to the other colleagues to congratulate you for the re-election as President of the Assembly, and I wish you a very successful year ahead. Please be sure that you have all our supports, and hope to have your support when we will be in need, as you have done so far. Dear colleagues, autocracies are once again the greatest threat not only to freedom and democracy, but also to peace and international stability. Once again, we must stand against them wherever they emerge. History has taught us a painful lesson. Appeasing autocrats does not work. Diplomacy alone does not stop them. Tolerating authoritarianism for the sake of stability is not a solution. Sooner or later, autocrats bring conflicts, instability, and threats that extend beyond their own borders. We must take a firm stand against authoritarian leaders and all those who abuse power and violate human rights. Recent debates have focused on Georgia, Belarus, but I want to draw your attention. There are other countries where democracy is under siege. Beyond the overwhelming propaganda often financed by corruption and organized crime, a dark reality remains. Men and women in my country are denied their most fundamental right, the right to freely vote. And when the right to freely vote is stripped away, all other rights become illusion. Today I stand before you to raise my voice against the erosion of democracy and political freedom in my country, Albania. This is not just my or opposition fight. It must be everyone's fight. If we do not stand together now, the democracy in our countries will slide backward. But we must unite to send a clear message to all authoritarian leaders. Democracy is not negotiable. We must never trade democracy for the so-called stability. We must never allow people's interests to be sacrificed for private gains. What we ask is support for securing to people the most fundamental right, the right to freely vote. Help ensure that Albanians can cast their ballot in the coming elections freely and secretly, so they and only they choose who will govern them. We urge you not to support the leaders in Albania or in the Balkans who abuse power and violate political rights. This assembly must send a strong message. We stand firm for pluralism and democracy. So we send a clear message of hope to activists, intellectuals, and politicians who fight every day for freedom and democracy in our countries. We show them they are not alone. We encourage ordinary people in our countries to refuse silence and to demand their fundamental rights. Because where people stand, freedom stands. Where people fight, democracy grows. Let us stand together. Let us defend democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Albana, and for your kind words, of course. And our next colleague is Mr. Sorin Titus Musasiu. He is speaking on behalf of the European Conservatives and Patriots.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations on your re-election. And frankly, I have to thank you for the fact that you have the initiative to ask the Venice Convention about the situation in Romania. So for the people who are not familiar with, I'm telling you that on the 24th of November, we have presidential election. 3 days after that, 3 days before the second step, although the first step was certified by the Constitutional Court, the elections were ditched. They completely stopped the electoral process, although we have 50,000 people in diaspora already voting for the second step. And it's unprecedented in all the European countries that belong to the European Union to have an election cancelled during the election process. So the Constitutional Court being a political appointees, I'm not surprised. However, what follows is really worrisome. A former commissioner of the Commission of the European Union declared that what we did in Romania, we are going to repeat in Germany if we don't like the results. That's totally unacceptable. That's a backsliding on all the values that this Council of Europe keeps dear. First of all, it's against the human rights. Not only 9.4 million people who voted, but also people who were voted in. That's one. Secondly, it's a breach against the rule of law. There is no constitutional power to have certified an election and then backslide on that. And third one is the democracy. How we can say that we breach the Romanian constitution by saying that a candidate can be disqualified without being judged in the court of law. According to the Romanian constitution, only a panel of judges, I mean, you have to be in a trial, you have to be accused of something for your right to be elected to be deferred. That's the reason why I'm saying that I thank you very much for asking for the Venice Commission for an opinion, but when the opinion showed up, I believe that we have the right to ask our constitutional court, why did they fail on all those reasons, the human rights, the rule of law, and the democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sorin Titus, and of course for your wishes. And now we're going to the speakers list, and I call first Mr. Jose Maria Sanchez Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Me gustaría.
I would like to share some thoughts with you during this free debate here in the chamber, not on things that we have talked about in earlier debates on Georgia, for example, but you know, let's just take Georgia as an example, as a case study, and perhaps extrapolate from that. What I would say that we have an agreement on that issue, but it may be that the Council of Europe does not wish to admit into its ranks countries which seek to join when they do not carry out elections which are in accordance with fair and democratic principles. It's an indirect way, if you like, of allowing member states to reject member states who do not abide by those principles is perfectly legitimate, may be done elsewhere. But I do wonder whether the Council of Europe, in calling for the holding of free elections, is actually operating in accordance with the rules laid down by the Council of Europe. And if that is the case, that leads me on to reply that that is not possible. That cannot be the case, because that would mean that the Council of Europe would be imposing a sovereign decision on member states which do not accept such a decision. So if the Council of Europe deems that a member state is not operating in compliance with the democratic standards of the Council of Europe, then the only thing that it can do is to expel that country, in my view. It can't then claim to impose a decision which only a sovereign state alone can adopt. I mean, there are many examples of this, but for example, convening elections is a decision for a sovereign state. So that is one point I would make. Secondly, and once again, extrapolating from the case of Georgia, we would perhaps be using these elections, which have been observed by international experts, and if the elections have been validated, if it has been found there was no fraud, and if the elections have been carried out in a legitimate form, then what kind of criterion is that if we are then declaring the results of elections invalid? I mean, who will then determine what the atmosphere, the environment, the surrounding an election is supposed to be? I mean, you've got to be objective. Otherwise, I think that you are paving the way to arbitrary views which are always unjustified. I mean, there is nothing more vague and nebulous than this whole idea of a climate or an environment in which elections are held. Thank you.
Toroskai. Is Laszlo in the room? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would actually like to talk about democracy, freedom, and... Is it working? Yes. Okay. So thank you, Mr. President. I would actually like to talk about democracy, freedom, and freedom of speech, but at the same time, I'm sorry, but I also need to talk about myself, because we cannot talk about democratic elections, freedom, and freedom of speech as long as billionaires, global corporations interfere in elections. Yet this is what Meta is doing in the most violent and also the most sneaky way. Zsuzsanna Borvendég, MEP, and I have therefore written the following open letter to Mark Zuckerberg, the chairman of Meta Platforms. Dear Mr. Mark Zuckerberg, Meta has a practically monopolistic position in Hungary, as almost the entire Hungarian population uses Facebook and Instagram, making its role especially important for democratic elections. In Hungary, these platforms are inescapable, and the party cannot organize a campaign or a public forum without Facebook, since it is the primary platform where such forums can be advertised. On the 17th of May 2019, Meta deleted my Facebook page, which was one of the most active political pages in Hungary at the time. We now have evidence that my Facebook posts were reported in an organized manner by employees paid from public funds by a rival party in Hungary, acting under central orders, creating a network with the aim to have my posts censored by Meta, despite the fact that I did not break any rules. According to the email in our possession, the director of this party, Jobbik, issued the order for the organized reports on the 16th of May 2019, and Meta deleted my Facebook page the next day. Later, they also deleted my Instagram page without any explanation. Perhaps the most extreme and unprecedented measure, however, is that Meta has declared me a dangerous person, which means that my name cannot be written on social media platforms and no picture of me can be posted. For all this, I have already filed a lawsuit against Meta in Hungary. In its final judgment, the court ordered Meta to restore my Instagram page within 15 days, as Meta had deleted my Instagram page completely unlawfully. To this day, Meta's Dublin headquarters have not done so, which means that Meta has been violating the law for more than a year and a half. By doing so, Meta is sending out a message that it stands above the law. Dear Mr. Mark Zuckerberg, make it possible for me, as president of a parliamentary party, to use Meta's social media platforms under the same conditions and as any other citizen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is our colleague Roland Rino-Büchel in the room? No, so I go on with Stefan Bergeron.
Thank you much indeed, President. As is the last time I'm going to be taking the floor in this chamber, I hope you allow me to slightly deviate from the rules to talk a little bit about the freedom of expression. Last June, I spoke in this chamber as part of the current affairs debate on the threats to freedom of expression. In my speech, I deplored the rise of cancellation culture relating to self-proclaimed wokeism, and I gave a few examples of the dangerous effects that this has had here in Quebec and more broadly in Canada. The case of the novelist Yvan Godbout was one such example. I also reported on instances of censorship on university campuses in Quebec and Canada. So I'm not going to repeat myself today, but the work of Rapporteur Grippo and the subject of yesterday's debate on moderating social media content to safeguard freedom of expression are obviously intertwined. We are simply approaching the phenomenon of censorship from a different angle. It's about the role played by the increasingly powerful corporations behind social media in determining what we see and don't see online. Just as so-called progressives have forced professors and artists to self-censor or leave their profession, in recent years, the masters of digital public forums have been deciding for us what views and what content are acceptable. The report raises the issue of transparency in the implementation of content moderation policies, which are gradually disappearing. On X, formerly Twitter, for example, it has been observed that accounts have been suspended and content deleted without the slightest explanation as to why. Some of these suspended accounts belong to journalists and left-wing activists whose worldview Elon Musk obviously does not share. The report also discusses the stealth banning practiced by several companies behind social media. This is a practice whereby these companies de-reference or downgrade, as the report puts it, content that deals with controversial issues without informing the user concerned, making it invisible to other users. Censorship, whatever form it takes, and whatever company, government, or individual imposes it, violates our right to freedom of expression. We must all open ourselves to views with which we disagree and which may even offend, provided they are not hateful or do not incite violence. This is the very principle of the freedom of expression, the bedrock of democracy. As I will not be seeking re-election in the next Canadian elections, this will probably, as I just said, be my very last speech in this chamber. I'm pleased that it has been on a subject of paramount importance and one that is very close to my heart. Since 2019, I've spoken on more than 50 debates in this House, and I've had the good fortune to meet many of you, many of whom I befriended. I've truly cherished the time I've spent among you, and I'm more convinced than ever of the indispensable nature of this wonderful organisation. So let me say to you goodbye to you all, and I'd like to thank ever so much my colleagues from the different Canadian delegations who've helped me. I'd like to thank in particular the Secretariat of the Canadian Parliamentary Association with Europe. I'd like to thank the work of Mrs. Jessica Urka and my other colleagues. So goodbye to you all, and thank you very much indeed from the bottom of my heart.
Dear Mr. Begueron, thank you so much for being with us. We wish you all the best for you, your family, and the next plans that you have. Canada is very close always to the Council of Europe, and with this occasion I would like to thank the Government of Canada, the State of Canada, that participates in this assembly, which is very important for us, not only because we want our voice to be heard, but because we know that your state is serving democracy and is being exercised democracy for a long time now. And I have a personal reason. One of my beloved sisters lives in Canada since 1979. So thank you once again. Now, I'm going to give the floor to Alexander Merezko. Yes, Alexander, you have the floor.
Mr. President, I should start by apologizing before the interpreters because there was some mix-up, some confusion. Because of my fault, I thought that I would be speaking about the issue of discrimination against older persons. But it's even better that because I like this format when we can freely raise very important issues, and I will take this opportunity. Mr. President, this year is truly important for all of us for many reasons. Mark Twain famously once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And it seems like we're having this case in this year. As we all know, there are 3 important anniversaries this year. First of all, there is the 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazi regime in Europe. Second anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the creation of the United Nations. And the third anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the creation of the Nuremberg Tribunal and the start of Nuremberg trials. Each of these universities has a very profound symbolic meaning for us and for the Council of Europe. The first anniversary reminds us of the need to continue a struggle against fascism in all its reincarnations, in all its forms. In 1945, the free nations, the democratic nations defeated the Nazi regime, defeated German fascism. But now we have the war and we're struggling against the reincarnation of fascism, the new, the contemporary fascism, Russian fascism, which we call Russism. And we need to win this war. We can win this war only together. And second anniversary reminds us about the need to create a new international organization of collective security instead of the UN, because the UN has failed. It has turned into the new League of Nations. It's a club for debates. It doesn't perform its major function to maintain peace and security, to fight against aggressions. It's a total failure, and we need to come up with better, more effective solution. And finally, the third anniversary is about international legal responsibility. It's about accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide. That's why we need to support the Ukraine's efforts. This is exactly what the Council of Europe is doing by supporting us in this issue on accountability. No crime should go unpunished. We should bring to justice all war criminals, starting with Putin. And my suggestion is very practical and very concrete for the Council of Europe, for the pace. Mr. President, I think it's worthwhile to consider adoption of 3 resolutions commemorating these anniversaries, these dates, because these resolutions can be devoted to the lessons which we can draw from history, and we can look at these historic events from the point of view of contemporary events unfolding before our eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. And the last speaker on the list is Margot Greenwood from Canada.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yesterday, we heard how Ukrainian children forcibly deported to Russia have been deprived of the right to speak their own language. The goal has been to assimilate them into Russian society and destroy their Ukrainian identities. In hearing this, I was reminded of Indigenous peoples' experiences in Canada. Like many gathered here today, your languages and mine breathe life into our culture and help define who we are. In Canada, our Supreme Court wrote, "Language is so intimately related to the form and content of expression that there cannot be true freedom of expression by means of language if one is prohibited from using the language of one's choice." Just like everyone gathered here today and this week, there is a richness of linguistic diversity, including the lands now known as Canada. Yet not all languages hold the same privileges and protections. Some languages are privileged over others, even though these others may be the first languages of the land. These first languages are in crisis in Canada, and I dare say globally. In Canada, the federal government established residential schools to take children away from their families, eradicate Indigenous languages, and assimilate them in the dominant society. Sadly, this policy has had generational impacts which continue to today. Strides have been made, but we still live with the scars of the past, scars that I hope no children have to experience. I want to leave you with a memory of my youth. One day I found my father sitting at the kitchen table, writing his name over and over again on a scrap of paper. I asked him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I write good English." My dad only had grade 6 education. Like many who attended residential schools, he was forbidden and punished for speaking his own language, Cree. He learned to be less than those who oppressed him. He believed he spoke good English, and if his children spoke good English, they would be protected. My dad never taught me Cree. The colonial experience achieved its goal, and I live with that reality to today. Hi, hi.
Bravo. Thank you, Margot. Thank you, and especially for sharing this very interesting and intimate moment about your father. So, dear colleagues, the next item on today's agenda is the debate on the progress report of the Bureau and the Standing Committee, document 16096 and addendum 5. Are there any objections to these references? No objections. The references are approved. The references to committees proposed by the Bureau as amended are ratified. The references to committee proposed by the Bureau are ratified. I now propose that the other decision in the progress report, document 16096, addendum 5, be ratified. Any objections? No. The progress report is approved. The final business today is to constitute the Standing Committee. The membership of the Standing Committee is determined by Rule 17.3 as follows. The President of the Assembly, the Vice Presidents of the Assembly, the leaders of the political groups, the Chairperson of national delegations, and the Chairpersons of the General Committees. A full list of members is set out in Document Commissions 2025/02. The Standing Committee is accordingly constituted. We have now come to the end of our business. I would like to thank all members of the Assembly, particularly rapporteurs of committees, for their hard work during this part session. I would like to thank the Vice President who chaired during this part session, namely Mr. Bertrand Bouix, Bernadetta Coma, Blerina Guiliametti, Andres Brifroy, Morgan Siersen, Arusiak, Jules Hakian, Agnieszka Pomaska, and Lord Don Twig. I would also like to thank the staff and interpreters, both permanent and temporary, who have worked hard to make the past session a success. I would also like to express my sincere thanks to Anne Torregrossa, who is sat behind me. After joining the Minutes Department in April 2008, she subsequently helped to ensure that our meetings ran smoothly and provided invaluable support to the Vice Chairman and guiding our debates. On the occasion of your 36th and final sitting, Anne, I would like to pay tribute once again to your efficiency and commitment. Good luck and thank you again. We all have a story to say. Anne is my beloved name. It's the name of my daughter. So, dear colleagues, I declare the first part of the 2025 session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe closed. The sitting is closed. Safe trip back.